Welcome to today's Inspired Talk, the art of place planning, a framework to find the best home for every stage of life with Frederick. I'm Seth Streeter, Mission Wealth Chief Impact Officer. And as you know, our firm's purpose is to empower people to realize true wealth. And we know that true wealth is about more than optimizing our finances. It's really about living a fulfilled life. And these Inspired Talks are designed to help improve our lives by expanding our definition of wealth across different dimensions. And today we're going to be having a conversation about the environment dimension, which is one of those 12 dimensions. And it's really about feeling a sense of place and alignment with where you live. Let's kick off with a couple poll questions just to see how this lands with our group. Please answer this question. Are you considering any change of place of your primary residence or secondary residence? Or no, I'm not planning to think of any transitions anytime soon. Okay, so 51% of our people are considering a change of a primary residence in the next 5 years. Another 17% are considering the addition of a vacation home, and less than a third are not planning to move anytime soon. So over 2/3 of the group has a change of place kind of at the top of mind. Well, thank you for sharing that. We're going to do one more poll question before we begin. To what degree do you feel like your environment affects your sense of fulfillment? To a high degree, a good amount, a little bit, or not much at all? 70% feel a very high degree, and another 29% a high amount. So clearly we're in the right place. We're ready to jump in and think a little bit more deeply about place planning. And we have just the guy to do it. Frederick is a global expert on the intersection of place and longevity. As the founder and CEO of Here, Ryan is amplifying the impact of his recent book, Right Place, Right Time, to provide content, courses, and coaching in place planning. This is a holistic, research-based approach to help people find the right place for every stage of life, unlocking joy, peace of mind, and a sense of fulfillment. With over 20 years in the field, Ryan has worked with dozens of organizations, including Fortune 500 companies, health systems, and housing developers and operators. His work has been featured on CBS News, The Washington Post, Forbes, and other media outlets, and he's done numerous podcasts dedicated to healthy longevity. Ryan serves on the advisory council of Stanford's Center on Longevity. He graduated from Princeton University and Stanford Business School, and he resides in Austin, Texas. Ryan, we really appreciate you sharing with our Mission Wealth community today.
Yeah, great to be here, Seth. Well, thank you so much for including me, and I'm excited about this particular message, of course. And as you point out, Seth, it sounds like your audience they're geared up for this. They see the connection between your dimensions of life and how it links into environment. So thank you, everyone, for being with us. What I thought I would do is just share just a couple minutes foundationally before we get into some questions, as Seth alluded to, that he has and others that are queued up. And we encourage you to be as interactive as you'd like, asking questions in the Q&A section. Just a word on my background, just to add a little more detail to what Seth described, is I've been really fascinated about this question around longevity and the role of place for about 20 years. So I was in Silicon Valley before that, really drawn to innovation, and have now, over those 20 years, had a variety of different experiences. I've worked for housing companies. I've lived in communities, actually senior living communities. So I've seen that particular lens in the second half of life. Part of today's conversation was really an outgrowth of a book I wrote, Right Place, Right Time, as Seth alluded to, and some of the ripples from it. And a recognition that I think I stumbled upon the fact that where we live has such a huge impact on our lives, I think much more than many of us realize. So what I do for just a moment is lay out kind of three big ideas, and then again, roll back into some questions. And so the first idea I'd like to share with you is more broadly, and I understand from Seth that the number of people that have come in for these particular webinars are pushing the boundaries of wealth in this broad definition as Seth described. And longevity is one of the themes. And so to start off, I think it's important to recognize that longevity is a gift, but healthy longevity is earned. And so we look at the last century, I would argue probably the one of the biggest, if not the biggest, benefits, blessings even of the century is the fact that life expectancy more or less doubled from around 40 to 80. And this is expected to continue in our century. We have about 100,000 people that have lived, that are centenarians who are 100 or older. We expect that number to more than quadruple within 30 years to over 400,000 people. And so this idea of the 100-year life is a reality for more and more of us. Certainly from a planning context, that's important. So as individuals, we got to think about it. And I'm sure Mission Wealth and the advisory community has to think about more of this in advising clients. How do we manage wealth in the different dimensions that Seth described over this longer chapter? And in some ways, there's people that have a more bullish outlook. Dr. Rosian, he's the chief wellness officer at the Cleveland Clinic. He wrote a book several years ago called The Great Age Reboot. And his perspective, just his, but nonetheless one to perhaps think about, is with the gains that we expect through technology and healthcare and genomics and advances, we have this moving target of life expectancy. So if you're, say, 55 today, when you were born, life expectancy was 74. Well, based on his estimates, for example, he sees the average life expectancy really being 115. Similarly, if you're 75 today, when you were born, your life expectancy was 68. He similarly sees an average life expectancy of 100, another 25 years. So the point in this, as we play this out, is it's not just lifespan is not static, it's moving because of the different things that are happening in our lives. But to Seth's point earlier about wealth, it's not just about how long we live, it's also about having the financial resources, so the wealth span, the number of years that you are financially secure, and then also your health span, the number of years that you're in good health. And we know from science that genetics only account for about 20% of your longevity. It's much more about lifestyle and environment. And so as we think about it, again, longevity is a gift because we live in this modern era, but healthy longevity is earned. And that comes through purpose and social connection and so on. And the second point I want to raise with you is that place, I believe, is really the key to healthy longevity. And you heard some of this message, I think, from a prior speaker on this webinar, Dan Buettner, the founder of Blue Zones, and the work that he's been doing for a couple decades now. His insights in learning from where have people lived the longest, healthiest lives, this kind of handful of places across the world. Well, it's an acknowledgement that really place shapes us more than we shape place. And when we decide where to live and where to kind of be activated in where we live, we're looking out not just for our current selves, but our future selves. And when I say place, to just put a little bit of detail around that, in the work that I've done in this area, I really see it as 4 dimensions. There's the environment component, which is really the physical piece, the square footage, the location, etc. There's a second piece I see, which is really about your health, the way it influences your physical activity, your diet, your sleep, and so on. The third area is in the dimension of connection. So in the way that place shapes your social networks, your closest friends, your periphery friends, but that whole notion of the community supporting you and you supporting your community. And then the fourth and final dimension is really the financial, recognizing that place for many of us that own our home, it shows up as an item on an asset on our balance sheet, but also where we live is very instrumental in our cost of living. As we live these longer lives, potentially as long as Dr. Rosian talks about, that means that we have to think about how do we secure our financial well-being. Place has a key role in that. And so the third of 3 I'd like to leave you with as we set the foundation is that timing isn't something, timing is everything. So this idea that one place that might have been perfect when you maybe were first out of college may be different when you're raising a family, or maybe different when you're an empty nester, and different when you're older, and recognizing that your needs change, but so do places as well. So we have to think about not just understanding how important environment is, but also making sure that we're cognizant of the life stage that we're in. So with all that, part of the idea coming out of writing this book and the ripples it created is a recognition that this place dimension or his environment, as Seth has in his wheel, is so important that it deserves, I believe, its own discipline. And I call that place planning. And so the idea is if we care enough to eat our broccolis or make sure we walk our 10,000 steps a day, even more so should we focus to make sure that we're living in a place that allows us to thrive the way that we can. And when I talk about place planning, which we'll get in more as we open up the Q&A and so on, it's really being intentional about recognizing your like specific needs and desires for the life state that you're in and making sure you're kind of mapping it to the right place to help optimize your odds of thriving, recognizing that there's risks involved. We'll get into some of that in a moment, but really in some cases digging in to understand what your preferences and needs are, but also particularly if you have a spouse or a partner, how the two of you think about this along the journey, and how do you also, just like financial planning, how do you like anticipate the future, recognizing how there's shifts and to what extent can your place be flexible as your needs change. So with that, just giving you a few of the basics, longevity is a gift. Healthy longevity is earned. Finding your place, and my feeling is the key to healthy longevity. And timing isn't something; it's everything. I have a question that I'd like to drop in or encourage you to reference. Answer in the chat, I believe. And the question is this: if there's one thing you'd like to improve or change about your place, what would it be? Doesn't necessarily mean you have to move. Maybe there's a way to modify your place, or maybe it's as simple as reaching out to friends you've lost contact with or ones you'd like to get to know better. Let me state that question again. If there's one thing you'd like to improve or change about your place, like what would it be? Again, examples could be, you're looking for more square footage, less square footage, you want to be closer to friends, closer to family, closer to grandkids, maybe reduce your cost of living, maybe simplify your life. Just would be curious to see what's on people's minds. Yeah, proximity to friends. Yeah, close friends and neighbors. Yeah, absolutely. Natural light, lower maintenance. That's a big one these days. Yeah. Finding ways to design your home so it's more flexible is really key as your needs change. Yeah, access to running trails. I know Seth's an active walker, so I know that's something he values. Close to family. Yeah, good list here to get us thinking. Seth, back to you.
Great. Well, thank you for kind of outlining that orientation, Ryan. Would love to have you dive a little bit deeper into something you said. You said that place shapes us more than we shape place. So why does place shape us so much?
Yeah, Seth, it's one of these things where we tend to overestimate how much we're able to control our decisions. And it's, I am I would say, social scientist out of curiosity. I don't necessarily have a PhD in a social science degree, but as you read this research that's out there and the different articles that are published, it's crazy. Like where you live shapes you in the sense that if your friends are happy, you're more likely to be happy. If your friends are obese, you're more likely to be obese. If your friends are depressed, you're more likely to be depressed. And that I'm not encouraging you to defriend your depressed friends at all. That's not what I'm saying here. But we effectively, there's like a social contagion where the environment around you find yourself kind of molded by it. I'll give a small funny example. My family, we lived in the Mid-Atlantic for about a decade, and about 5 years ago we moved to Austin for a variety of different reasons, some of what certainly influenced by what we did our own place planning. Our oldest was going into high school. It was a good juncture for our change. We have family out in California, but yeah, I didn't eat any breakfast tacos in Baltimore. But in Austin, Texas, like, yeah, eating a lot of late breakfast tacos. So you do find yourself just assimilating, I would say subconsciously, with the culture of the place that you're part of. And that culture happens at the kind of macro level, Seth. but also at the micro level, like what even some of the habits within your neighborhood. If you're a neighborhood where there's a lot of walkers, you tend to say, oh, that's a good idea. I'll walk with a friend. You kind of get absorbed into it.
Yeah, makes sense. We are the company we keep, and proximity really shapes the company that we keep. It makes a lot of sense. One other high level question is really around place planning. This is kind of a new term to me, at least. I think probably to a lot of our Mission Wealth client community. Tell us a little bit more. What does place planning actually entail?
Yeah, so place planning in its kind of generic form, Seth, is basically it is providing intentionality and process to where you live and how you choose to activate where you live with a particular recognition for each chapter in life, looking at your current chapter, but also kind of a look ahead. And when we look at financial planning, so a good analog, when you're financial planning, you're oftentimes looking out for your future self. Okay, when Ryan Frederick is financial planning, he's making certain decisions today that have ramifications for the Ryan Frederick, 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. Well, a similar thing happens with place. Like if we look and we say, wait a second, this decision shapes who I am in such a significant way, place planning in its broad sense is just allowing some thought. So this is an intentional decision. That's on one end of the spectrum. It might mean I think about this more by myself. I talk to my spouse about it. It's a subject we talk about. That's on one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is more rigorous, Seth. It's following a process which better kind of unpacks the things that you value, the things that you need for your current stage and going forward. It's a process that allows ultimately in having like a place plan, just like you have a financial plan. So you have a plan that says, here's where I am, here are the factors going forward. My company here, that's part of what we provide is coaching and courses for people to get to that outcome. And Seth, I think it's an interesting, it's fitting that we're having this conversation because it is, I believe it's closely related to financial planning. In fact, it's quasi-financial because where we live has a very important financial analysis dimension to it. It's just that it's so much more than that. And
Yeah,
so many of us are place planning, whether we call it or not. But I would say also many of us are maybe not as intentional as we should be. And particularly for people in the second half of life, I'll say, and even within that, maybe 70 years or older, these are big decisions. It's a big decision to stay where you are. It's a big decision to move somewhere else. And those decisions have consequences. And so if you don't take it as seriously as you could and you make a mistake, that can have a number of consequences financially, relationally, energy, health wise. And so it's just leaning into, I think, a discipline that'll help our society make better decisions around this.
sure. And having been a financial advisor for 33 years, I've seen how the financial planning around residency has really shifted. It used to be that the home was the center of the financial plan. And, a family would move, let's say they got a job in a new city, they got their home, and then everything built around the home. Maybe their place of worship, their kids' schools, where they shop, the parks they went to, the neighbors. And, the home was usually the most prized asset on the balance sheet. And we've seen, with kind of millennials and younger, and obviously with the pandemic and with digital nomads, there's been a huge shift where people aren't wanting the home to necessarily be the largest asset on their balance sheet. They want flexibility, they want mobility. So we've really seen this shift. And I'm just curious where you see this trend going as you look at people's relationships with their residences and maybe when they've had a life event, which we'll talk about, they've empty nested, they've retired, they're now thinking about living in different ways. And maybe it's a place on the coast and it's a place in Portugal. So let's talk a little bit about these trends that you see shifting around the primary home.
Yeah, Seth, it's a part of what you're describing is like our culture today and how it's changing and it's fascinating. I mean, one of the things I talk about a bit how we have more people are living longer and the implications of that. But another thing that's happening is that fewer people, we're having fewer kids. And for those that do have kids, they are less likely to live approximate to their parents. My parents, they joke around, they give us a hard time. My parents live in Northern California. I live with my family in Austin. My younger sisters, two of us, she lives in Australia. So while they have kids, there's no one like locally to support them. They're in the early 80s in Northern California, and so we got this dimension where it's a big question, Seth. It's like how much do we, as we think about living longer and thriving longer, who do we depend on? How
Mm,
much do we make this tension between, you saw it in some, I think some of the questions earlier, the what would be one dimension. How important is it to be close to your friends and family? How important is it to be in a climate that you desire? How important is it to be in a lower cost of living? I think, in generically, Seth, I mentioned this in the book. I was an electrical engineer in college, I barely survived. And there was a physics class I took, which still gives me nightmares. And the final question it was something about a ball dropping and going through these different hoops. And anyway, it said, express your answer in 25 Greek variables. And I just like was blown away. And to some degree, that's the exercise here. There's all these things that factor in, and what might be perfect for Seth may be the wrong place for Ryan. Or maybe the perfect place for Seth at age 30 is different than the best place for Seth at age 50. So our culture is shifting for sure. Like I described, the fewer kids aren't close to where they are. There's more what we call solo agers, where either they're childless, they're single, their kids don't live near them. But how you think about these key levers and also how we think about risk is really important. And it's an individual decision.
yeah.
And that's the I would say that's the biggest thing. But I think you are seeing, to answer the last piece, people are much more open in their thinking than they've been perhaps in the past. Although I think there's a lot more, even more openness to what can be options as you weave together the right life for people.
Yeah. And in decision making, it's nice to be optimistic and to kind of go after what you want, but it's also hard to not have that defensive mindset and kind of think sometimes out of fear. And I know that a lot of people are thinking with that mindset today. And maybe it's climate risk. We just had these horrible fires in Los Angeles. We had the flooding in North Carolina. People are looking at where they live from a climate risk standpoint, saying, "Gosh, if I can't get insurance here because I'm in a flood zone or a hurricane zone, I might need to think about shifting to somewhere that is I'm able to get insurance." So the climate risk is something that people are thinking about. I think people are also thinking about social risk, political risk. And financial risk, right? So there's a lot of these thoughts around kind of fear aspects of decision making. How do you guide the folks that you're kind of coaching through this process to think about kind of the positive aspects? They really seek more longevity, better friends, better neighbors, a beach walk, versus kind of some of these fear-based elements.
Yeah, we live in an interesting time for sure. When you look at the data, and when you Chip Conley on with Inspire Talk, he may have referenced this. There's something called the U-shaped happiness curve, and you have a certain level of happiness in your 20s, and it kind of dips down a bit, and in your late 40s, early 50s hits this kind of nadir. Like I like to think it has something to do with teenage kids, and then you kind of work your way up, and then in your 70s and so on, you're actually happier than you were in your 20s. So it's, in fact, it's more than a you. Actually, it kind of goes beyond. And there's a bunch of reasons, the theories behind that. It's actually a global phenomenon, this U-shaped happiness curve. And so we do tend to be we can be more risk averse as we age, but our happiness tends to be grounded in bigger, more meaningful things like our friendships, and we find different levels of purpose in certain ways. So I just want to say that as a broad narrative, it's important. Getting older doesn't necessarily, despite what we might see in the card aisle at a Hallmark store, that it is actually a good thing for sure in a number of different dimensions. But going back to how we think about risk, those are real things, Seth, and we have to recognize that two things. And this is again very much parallels, I think, financial planning and the work that that you do at Mission Wealth, because you have to have some sense, without emotion, what is the risk of maybe where you are or where you're considered going, and climate risk would be one of them. And what's your like risk tolerance or risk capacity for some of these things? And it's so horrific about the fires, in Southern California, and recognizing that when some of this happens, what is your, as an individual, like what is your ability to handle, I'll say catastrophic risk? Like, oh my gosh, my house burned down, or even more. I have a close friend, a family friend, lives in Sonoma County. There's a they haven't had direct exposure to a fire, like it hasn't impacted their property, but there's this ongoing fear every night of what if a fire were to happen. So there's also this kind of ambient risk. So I think a lot of it, Seth, is trying to lean into qualifying. And there's tools that are out there, tools we have that can help people approximate from there's some interesting political maps around this. Like, what if you don't get along with your neighbor? Or, if you move to a place, how do you think about that? So there's a way to calibrate some of that risk, but then there's also a level of self-reflection. To what extent can do I or my spouse, do we, what's our capacity for this risk? Do we want to, now all that being said, particularly as I mentioned earlier, some of the longevity statistics, people might be living for a long time. And when we're planning, we're not just planning, good planning isn't just for the average, right? We have to think about the distribution of outcomes. And it's entirely possible that we just have to be more aware of recognizing that we might move to a place and we might have to move again down the road if circumstances change for different reasons. But
Mhm.
it's I think a real thing. And for people that don't think about it, they can be more blindsided if something, happens they fully didn't expect.
Yeah. We just posted into the chat a nice resource we found recently called Climate Check. So you can put in your address and it gives you different scores across different climate risk. You might just take a look at that. We're not endorsing it, but just a resource for you to consider. Ryan, let's get to life transitions. So I personally navigated this recently and used place planning as one of my solutions. I empty nested a year ago, and my home was a home where my kids and all their friends were often. And so when they launched, I thought, gosh, this house is going to feel quite empty with me and my cat on a Zoom screen most of the day. So I said, let me just rent my house in Santa Barbara for a year. I'll call it a 1 year experiment, and I'll move to Austin, Texas, where I had some connection. It's a place that has a lot of health and longevity, and we had an office here and a growth area. So I thought, let me just give it a shot. And so I planted myself at age 54 in a brand new city that I'd really never spent much time in, just to see how this experiment could unfold. Mostly because I just didn't want to miss my kids so much in this new emptiness phase of my life. And so my daughter was on the East Coast, my son was on the West Coast, I was in the middle. And so it's been a great experiment for me. I mean, it hasn't been easy at times. You have to find your new doctor and your new vet and your sense of place. I've moved a few times to kind of get settled, but it's been very expansive for me, and I've been able to maintain all my friendships in Santa Barbara. So it's been, an add, a plus, not a subtraction. And I always have the ability to move back. So I kind of have that comfort tether. I'm just curious how life transitions seem to affect place planning with the folks you're working with. Is that a common trigger?
Yeah, it's a really common trigger, Seth, and we're Austin is grateful for your experiment. Um, it is. I mean, I think what happens when you have life transitions that are predictable, and some of that is empty nesting, some of that is retiring. You can kind of look ahead and say, wait a second, what do I want that chapter to look like? And so when you do that, it does raise questions about, your time and your energy and the pursuits you have, and place invariably is weaved right into that. And so if you want to experience a different life or different social networks, there's things you can do without changing your place, but oftentimes a change of place can help spark a lot of this. One of the things I want to emphasize, so yes, it's very common that there are these life transitions that are predictable, some that are less predictable. Like maybe there's a situation where there's a health event you or a spouse has, or maybe a relationship or a marriage dissolves, less expected. And so there's an author, he describes them as life quakes. When these big things happen, life quake hits, reevaluate. And I strongly urged and have certainly witnessed like places on the list of things to be thinking about. One of these, and also at the same time, I mentioned this earlier in the prepared remarks, is that places change. So places, the climate risk may change, the traffic may be higher, the cost of living may be higher. Like there's things your specific dwelling may be too big to maintain, too costly. Maybe you got an issue with your roof. Like so, you can change, but also places change, and in a sense, they're both transition moments. And when those transition moments happen, that's a logical time to say, okay, where might place planning fit into this? I want to just emphasize one thing you mentioned, Seth, because I think it's really helpful to our audience and looking at some of the questions that have come through is we can really, this goes back to psychology. It's very easy to be overconfident in life. It's easy as in people that pick stocks to be overconfident sometimes in the performance of that stock, but it parallels a bunch of things in life. So sometimes people have an image of what a new place would be like, and they get so like in love with that vision of what it's gonna be like, it starts to divorce the reality that they don't really know. And so, if someone decides they want to move to Florida, say they're in the Northeast and they want to move to Florida, they have in their mind what that life's going to be like. They sell their house, they move down, and then they say, "Oh, whoops, this is it's not what I thought it was." If they burnt the bridge by selling their house and all the possessions, then that's much more difficult to then swap back to what happened before. And then in a smaller example, even in Austin, we have some friends where we live just outside the city. They lived in a suburban house. They wanted to be the cool kids down in the, just like you, living in the urban environment, in this case, a condo, and they sold all the possessions and then sold their house, their possessions, moved downtown to a condo. And then they found out about 6 months in, it wasn't big enough. They didn't actually like the urban lifestyle. Their friends didn't come see them. It was an oh whoops an event that cost them financially, relationally, energy. And so there's this idea: how can you experiment if you can in some of these bigger decisions?
Yeah, so if you're thinking about living abroad, maybe go rent a place, VRBO in Portugal or Spain or wherever you're thinking about for a couple months. See how that goes. Get a taste for it. You're thinking about moving from a residence in a suburban environment to a high rise with 24-hour concierge and all the amenities. Go try to live in a high rise. See how that lands for you. So I really like that advice of doing some trial and error and experimenting a little bit instead of just taking the full leap and then having to perhaps unwind if it doesn't, suit you.
That's right. We call it design thinking. It's a common term in innovation circles, but it's really about human-centric design. You have a theory, a hypothesis, you test it with a prototype, you learn, and we do that. That's how the computer mouse was created. But why don't we just apply that same thinking to our lives? And I think we can make better decisions and save some unnecessary hardship.
Yeah. With regard to living outside the US, I think there's probably a greater appetite for this than perhaps ever. And I'm just curious for those people that you've coached on it, how do you help them think about what parts of the world to consider, what cities within those parts of the world, how to do the trial and error? Do you have any guidance for folks that are actually seriously thinking about living abroad?
Yeah, it's a big question, and it is a more relevant question, Seth, than I think it was in the past. What I would do is I kind of separate the why and the how. And so when you go through the why, I think it can be helpful because there can be a push-pull dynamic. Well, why are you interested? To what extent? What are those why questions? How much of it is political? How much of it's cost of living? How much of it may be social related? Understanding the why can inform I would say the best decisions about the where. And when we say internationally, it's so personally based, Seth, because for some people it may be more driven by cost of living. For others, it may be driven by just the quality of life that's there, including the climate. For others, it may be where is there an expat community that's already kind of has a beachhead you can be part of. Portugal, you referenced that. Portugal has been a spot that a number of people have moved to. They've had historically some advantageous policies that we're attracting people from other countries, including the US. Some of those policies have changed now. It's not as easy as it once was. And even beyond that, when we say place, just to emphasize something on this, just again, foundationally, when I say place physically, it's not just your four walls, something you see on Zillow, and oh my, that's an amazing kitchen. It's also, your block, your neighborhood, your metropolitan area, whether you're urban, suburban, rural, your state, your county, region of the country, region of the world. So I say that because when we say Portugal, of course, Portugal's not a huge country, but there's all different options within Portugal. So if you're going to go down that path and you want to go down that path using design thinking, how do you kind of narrow it is a really key piece. But understanding the why of it will help inform how you make that decision. One last point on that, Seth, is that people be wary of the best places lists. Best places to retire, best places to go internationally. That can be instructive to a point, but their rubric for you to go find that spot may not be the filter that you would have. And in some cases, people are paying to be on those lists. So just recognize there's layers to it. It's not just the how, but also the why.
Yeah. And I see a number of financial questions coming into the chat, and I would just say, let's please direct those towards your wealth advisor. Or if you're not currently working with Mission Wealth, you can reach out to us. We'll put an email in the chat and we'll have an advisor speak to you, because there are other strategies to consider. There's 1031 exchanges. There are options that clients can consider as far as those properties that have appreciated to a great deal and you have significant capital gains that you should be informed of, but they're not, without trade-offs, right? So there's trade-offs to consider with any of those financial questions, and we're happy to answer those one-on-one. Feel free to reach out to your advisor. Okay, so let's talk about the emotional side of this, Ryan. So yes, we're thinking about the environment. Okay, I can pick, I want to live in a warm climate. I want to be close to a beach. I know I have a certain financial limitation of what I can afford. It's feeling like it's good from those dimensions. I think there'll be some friends there. I already have 2 friends that live in that city. But to actually pull the trigger and to leave what is familiar, a home that maybe we've lived in a long time, and to transplant ourselves across a city, across a state, across a country, or across the world, it's a big step. So what are the emotional aspects to this? How does one really untether from their sense of place in order to best be available to their new environment?
Yeah, it's a huge question, Seth, and so important. I would say it starts with courage.
Mm.
It is having written Right Place, Right Time, and having spoken to people when writing it. A lot of people on the other side now, of course, either have taken place planning courses or coaching, is that there's a first step is giving yourself permission to think differently. You know, Particularly for people in the second half of life. And I'll step back for just a second. When I say place planning is relevant for people across the entire adult age spectrum. The average American adult moves at least a dozen times. I've got a senior in high school. In the next few months, he's going to be making a place planning decision. Where does he go to college? His friendship circles are going to be tied into this. He's going to be in a spot where his opportunities, his friendships will be shaped differently by going to one place versus another. But to shift back for people in the second half of life, and I think Stanford's doing some great work in this area. There's the Stanford Center on Longevity. They've created something called the New Map of Life. And the New Map of Life basically is a testament to how can we imagine new chapters of life. And it used to be you would get educated, you would earn, and then you would retire. And now, in the context of this longer life, you can have all sorts of different chapters that work their way in there. And so I would say part of this is having the courage to think differently than maybe your parents did, to think differently than that 3-act life I just described, to say, wait a second, if I wanted to have a different chapter for this, what might it look like in this? So there's courage in thinking differently. There's courage in something it's not as simple, but as simple as just decluttering. Seth, you mentioned when we were planning this call how you had a speaker earlier on Inspired Talks about decluttering. That itself it takes courage and leaning into emotion to get rid of stuff. And for some personalities, that's more difficult than others. And then I would say even the planning process takes courage because you're saying, actually, I'm leaning into this. I'm allocating time to really think about this either on my own or with peers. And then last but not least, certainly, is that execution. And so even to get all queued up, I'm sure for you, I can speak to myself when we as a family, we had thought about this and talked about it emotionally. My wife and I, shared our feelings around this. When we popped in that car and we drove our family thousands of miles from Baltimore to Austin, it was emotional roller coaster. Like we had to, say goodbye somewhere to you. We stayed in close touch with our close friends, from Baltimore, but recognizing moving into a new chapter means saying goodbyes, but also it means opening up new possibilities and a recognition that we're not going to nail it. Like we lived in three different places before we ended up in our current home now. Like it's going to be bumpy. And so to have courage, it's a huge thing. And in fact, if for those out there and even the wealth advisors on the call here today, it's so important. You got to get the facts right, you got to get the thinking right, but we have to lean into the emotion and recognize this. And last piece I'll say on this, you kind of got me fired up on this one, is that there's a unique challenge for solo agers. If you're coming out of a relationship, if you've lost a spouse, that there's a lot of emotion rolled up in this, and it's important to acknowledge that. It's important to sit with that and recognize there may be some planning that can be done at the proper moment, but there also can be a separation of time between the planning and then the execution.
Right. And thinking about it, put in following the breadcrumbs of curiosity or of your interest. We had a really beautiful story of a client of ours who had empty nested her two daughters to college. They went to the East Coast, she was West Coast. And soon thereafter, she and her husband divorced. And so she really felt isolated. She felt lonely. She had more than enough money. The financial plan said she was going to be fine. But she didn't really feel that sense of purpose because she was active as a wife and a mom, and those identities had kind of left her. And so, in speaking to her, we found out that she actually really loved giving back to women who'd gone through domestic abuse situations. She'd been a volunteer there, and she also loved skincare. She loved, giving her daughters facials and so forth. So, I encouraged her to think about going and getting her esthetician license and converting what was formerly her husband's office in the home into a home studio to give facials with the nice chair and the steamer. And so she did just that. She converted her room to an esthetician's studio, and she ended up donating free facials for a local battered women's shelter. And so she felt such a sense of purpose. She was able to nurture these women. She also did, facials for friends and family. And it like opened up a whole new chapter of her life. And it had something to do with place planning because she utilized a room that before was associated with her ex-husband's office that now was a place for community connection and her being able to nurture and give back. So it's also just reimagining what are ways that we want to live, what are passions we have, and how might place planning correlate to that?
Seth, that's a great example. Like in most cases, place planning doesn't mean a move. It
Yeah.
just more often than not, it means a reorientation to the place that you're in. In fact, even if you're hell-bent on moving somewhere else, it's really valuable. In fact, it's part of the process we have in the course is to understand in what ways could you make your current place better? Because one of the benefits of your current place is you know it. Like the good and the bad. When you move to somewhere else, as we talked about earlier, there can be for some of us, we can romanticize the positive and we can underestimate what some of the challenges might be. So for example, like even in my life, my wife, she just went, she turns 50 this year. She just went back to nursing school. It's her like third or fourth career, depending how we look at it. And she said, I want to be able, I've been an entrepreneur, I've done other things. I want to be able to help people in this tangible way as a nurse, maybe become a nurse practitioner. So she found a program in an accelerated year, and she converted one of our bedrooms to her office space to get this thing all worked. It was an intense year. And so life can afford us these different chapters, as it plays out. So I think that's a important part of this. I mean, one thing I want to talk about that in just a second too, is that your example, there was a purpose that was identified, and how can place support that purpose?
Mm,
There's another thing I want to emphasize we haven't talked about yet, which is just the inherent dimension of flexibility. So when we're in this uncertain time with rapid technology changes, with AI and disruption in the labor force that's happening and likely continue to happen, and just what will happen over this longer life, when there's a lot of uncertainty, that to me often equates to a value of flexibility.
mm,
And you can see that when you construct your investment portfolios, but it also applies to place. So if you're in a spot where, let's say you're 70 and you got a house that has 3 different floors, and maybe you're got inclement weather, whatever the dimensions are, like that place may not be, your physical dwelling may not be very flexible if your needs or desires change over time. And
yeah.
so as you're looking at different chapters, it's important to think, well, in what way this place that I'm in, can it be flexible as my life changes? And that's relevant for your 4 walls, like we're talking about, but it's also relevant if you move to a place that may be a lower cost of living, but if it's not set up to thrive over time, it might force a move down the road, or maybe there isn't great healthcare there. Maybe it's not an issue in your 50s and 60s, but maybe becomes a huge issue in your 70s, 80s. So being like planning for flexibility, I think, is a really important kind of attribute of place planning.
I love thinking about how place can also be a metaphor for our lives. Something Chip has shared is that, when we build an atrium inside a home, it's a place for light to come in. Usually there's spaciousness, maybe there's plants, there's a yoga mat, it's kind of this expansive element that you've added to your home. And how can we think of midlife as a midlife atrium? So, what is the midlife atrium that you're wanting to invite more of in your life? And how can you make changes to your place in order to represent that? If it's more health, if it's community, it's maybe some chairs to sit down and have tea with a good friend. If it's exercise, if it's reading, a little reading nook, if it's gardening, if it's pottery, and maybe a little pottery wheel. How can you think of your midlife atrium and aligning your place planning with that?
Think of place in this dimension as you're describing as an enabler. In what way
Mm,
is your place enabling the life you want to have? And go back to our conversation earlier, like shaping your future self. And I'll give you like kind of a dumb example, just tactically. Um, do you have a TV? And I recognize with our smartphones and our iPads, everything's a TV these days. But if, let's say, you're like, okay, I want to make sure I'm spending less time idly watching television. Well, do you have a TV that's in one of your main hangout spots that becomes a distraction like that? Should that be a painting or something else, and then relocate the TV somewhere else? There are these tactical things in your place that basically dictate your behaviors.
mm,
And so
yeah,
you got layers to this as you think it through.
sure. Please post any questions that you have in the Q&A box. Would love to get to as many of those as we can. I would love to go to one that Nina shared, which is when thinking about moving from independent living, your own home, to a supportive community, whether that's an independent or assisted living, how do you know when it's the right time? Would love to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Nina, great question. And so part of what makes place planning tricky is that we all have our own different journeys, and we describe this over a life continuum. So the questions, of course, someone might have when they're thinking about what college to go to is different than someone
Yeah.
like later in life. But to zero in on this specific one, it's really hard to get the right time. And what most people do, Nina, is they miss the right time. And when
Hmm.
they miss the right time, what ends up happening is um, when they miss the time, it becomes, in some cases, a like urgent situation that if they're not prepared for, their range of options become more limited. Now, that being said, how can we best predict this? Well, if you're in an independent living community or loved ones in an independent living community, there are ways in which you can understand through number of the communities I'm familiar with, you can get some sense of what is the health of you or your loved one. To what extent are people actively leaning on even health resources or within that community? Oftentimes, even independent living, there's care that can come to them. So I think there's a piece to just recognize kind of what is the degree of care needs. That's typically what the trigger, is to move to higher levels of care. What is it right now? To what extent, going back to our flexibility question, to what degree can some care be brought into someone in independent living? Typically, the threshold becomes just level of care, or in some cases dementia care needs that really requires someone to move to a higher level of care, but it's very nuanced. I would just say that if you're not paying attention to how life can shift, it can surprise you in circumstances where it perhaps shouldn't surprise you. And particularly if you're in a place that doesn't have higher levels of care, if you actually have to move to an entirely different community, that can be very disruptive. So that's some ways to think about, Nina, but there's a lot more there we could follow up on.
And I think expanding your sense of what's possible, I can just share a personal story. My mom unfortunately had a fall last year and she didn't want to get a cane. She didn't want to get any walker. She's like, I'm fine. And unfortunately, she had another fall, had a concussion, and unfortunately, she's made it back from that. But now she's using a walker, and she was just committed to never using a cane or walker. She had so much pride in her independence. She had a huge garden. My parents have always been super active in Colorado. And she now uses a walker and she has more freedom that she has a walker. She has more sense of safety and security because she has her balance with her. And it required her to expand her sense of what before she thought she was committed to. So I think it's also just being more open to getting support, to accepting resources, and you can still have great quality of life with a little bit of help.
So oftentimes what gets us in trouble, Seth, is ourselves. Because and I have a funny example recently. The kids gave me I think for Father's Day last year reading glasses.
Mhm.
And the truth is I'm like, why did I get reading glasses? Well, I really needed them now. And so more than I realized. And so now there's things I can read I just couldn't read before. And there was some dimension of not I wasn't quite literally seeing reality. And as we get older, like there are life shifts, and part of it is having, again, the courage and the self-awareness to recognize, okay, I'm in a different place. Maybe I shouldn't be running 20 miles a day on trail runs for different reasons. You pick the example. And so, but I think what happens if we, and this is oftentimes most people talk about wanting to age in place
Mm.
for basically their whole lives. Something like 90% of people, that's their preference. And I offer a hard pushback to that because it often doesn't just recognize how your preferences, needs change and how places change. And so if you're hell bent on that, odds are you're not optimizing your life. And so, and go back to your mom's example, if she's like, okay, I'm never going to use a walker, well, then she would be held back from these pieces of life that she likes. So it's hard. Life changes, and we have to just recognize these changes so we make good decisions around it. Part of it with planning is to anticipate some of those changes. One thing that kills me is seeing people remodel homes and make it seem as though they might never have a situation where there could be any mobility issue, even
Mhm.
something short term. But less than 4% of the housing stock in the entire US has been designed with people with even just limited mobility issues. We've pretended as though, we're not going to age. And that's, of course, not reality.
Right. One of the questions was around how do I find an intentional living community? And I did put in the chat MEA, which was the world's first midlife wisdom school. That's Chip Conley's community. They have a couple campuses in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and also in Baja, and a number of online programs. There's many others. I would also invite you to think about how you can spark an intentional community with where you live. There's really great little books of cards that have, question cards. You can invite some neighbors over and you could say, hey, we're going to do something different. We're going to do deep listening, deep sharing. We're going to go through these card exercises, and it might seem a little, corny at first, but I'll tell you, people will really love it. They'll really connect. And so you can start your own intentional community. That's just an invitation to kind of expand your social circle that way. And I'll kind of give you some closing remarks, Ryan, and then I'll get us to one exercise to have us adjourn today.
Well, this is great, Seth. Invariably, what happens when I've done these talks and webinars, we just don't have enough time to field
Yeah.
different questions. And a lot of times, these questions, they're custom to your particular situation. So, a few things just in closing. I do hope that this hour that we spend allows you to think a bit more about why place is such a consequential decision. And it doesn't mean you move. Like you're effectively making this decision whether you realize it or not by virtue of where you live and how you choose to activate where you live. A few things to think about. One, in the book, Right Place, Right Time, there's an assessment, and people love the assessment. So I
We
took
just put it in the chat too.
Oh, perfect. So what I did, I put that online. I've made some further modifications. It takes on average like 2 to 3 minutes, helps you unpack the four different areas: environment, health, connection, and finances. And so it provides an opportunity for self-reflection on this. Um, if you're someone that you want to go deeper on this, there is the book, which allows you to go deeper on it. There's recently, Seth, we've added a self-guided intro to place planning that you can take on the here.life website. We also offer courses as part of a peer group that people can take that ultimately gives you a place plan on the other side, provides clarity on the other side of complexity. And the last thing I would say is, I've mentioned this to Seth, my vision is that no one's heard of place planning. This is new. This is, avant-garde. We're doing it without necessarily providing those particular terms, but I would encourage you to ask these questions with your wealth advisor. Hey, like, how should I think about this? Because I think more and more over time, this is a discipline. I think more wealth advisors, as they lean into all those dimensions of wealth, as Seth described, like, in what way can your wealth advisor help provide some of that guidance to make wise decisions?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for sharing the insights. And I thought we'd do one last quick little chat brainstorm. What was a new insight you learned today or something that you would like to embrace from what was discussed today? Let's kind of crowdsource just one idea you have with your own place planning, one expanded mindset you have. Just post it in the chat. Let's see how we can learn from each other here on our own place planning journey. We'll see as these ideas come in. One idea, one learning that you got from today that you hadn't really fully considered before, and now you're going to noodle on a little bit. So reorientation of current place, having the courage to think differently, having a structured process, temporary moves to try things out versus huge moves, to try not to romanticize so place planning can be realistic. That's great. The idea that changing your place doesn't necessarily mean a move. Yeah. That we really like where we live today. Great, Nina. Experiment with living in a new location before full investment. People don't miss the right time, so don't wait. So people do miss the right timing, so don't wait. How place supports purpose. Some of the resources look good. Love the idea of deep listening and deep sharing group. And that might be something even we could help support at Mission Wealth. If you're interested in that, you can put that in the survey and we might be able to organize a client circle to discuss this further. Stay flexible, understand your risk capacity. So we've got some great takeaways, Ryan. Thank you so much.